All right, welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're going to dig into a really fascinating model of the mind, one that might completely change how you see, well, everything, yourself, the world, and all the people in it. So let's just jump right in. You've been there, right? You and a friend see the exact same thing happen. But when you talk about it later, it's like you saw two different events. How does that happen? Well, this model says it's not about one of you being right and the other being wrong. Nope. It's about the actual fundamental machinery running inside our heads. So here's our game plan. We're going to start with your own personal reality loop, then see how different loops create different minds. We'll tackle the ego, what it actually is, and see how this all builds up to explain why we can't seem to agree on anything and what reality even means. All right, let's get into it. Okay, first up, your personal reality loop. This is the engine of your experience. Think about it. There's this simple but incredibly powerful feedback loop running in your mind every single second you're awake. It's literally building your world from the ground up. So at its core, your mind is basically a self-updating reality engine. It's this constant cycle, right? It shapes what you even notice in the first place, how you feel about it, what you think is going to happen next, and then what you actually do. The model gives it a name, the perspective expectation cycle. We'll just call it the PEC. And here's the crucial part. These 4 steps aren't just a list. You got to see them as locked together in this continuous, self-reinforcing loop. Your perspective, what you see, kicks things off. Your feelings then act like a filter on that information. That biases what you expect to happen, and that expectation drives you to act. But then, your action changes the world, which changes what you see next. It just keeps going, a personal reality engine humming along. And I want to be really clear here. This whole PEC thing, it's not just a cute metaphor. The model we're looking at presents this as a formal structural mechanism. This is supposedly the blueprint for how every single moment of your conscious experience gets built. All right, section 2. So, you might be thinking, if we're all running on this same basic loop, why on earth are our minds so incredibly different? Great question. And the answer, according to this model, is actually pretty simple. It all comes down to the tuning. And this is a really big idea. It means neurodivergence isn't a broken loop. It's just a different parameterization of the same loop. So instead of seeing things like ADHD or autism as a deficit or something wrong, this model just sees them as different, totally valid ways of tuning the human system. A different setting, not a bug. This table really drives the point home. Look at this. For someone on the autism spectrum, maybe their loop is tuned way up on internal sampling, creating this super high-resolution inner world. For ADHD, maybe the loop is just spinning way faster. Action and sampling happen before the expectation part can even catch up. Rejection sensitivity, the emotional lens is just cranked way up on social threats. It's the same machine, you see, just different knobs turned to different places, creating profoundly different ways of experiencing life. So if you take one thing away from this part, it's this quote. Neurodivergence is perspective divergence, not deficit. It's a huge shift, right? It's about stopping and asking, how is this perspective tuned, instead of what's broken? It's about different ways of seeing, not a wrong way of being. I think that's incredibly powerful. Okay, on to our third section, the ego. Now, this brings up a puzzle, doesn't it? If this reality loop is always running, always updating, constantly in flux, then what gives us that stable, consistent sense of me? You know, what we call the ego. What is that in this model? Well, here's the thing. The ego isn't some little person sitting in a control room in your head. No. According to this model, the ego is what's called a dynamical attractor. It's a stable pattern that just emerges. Think of a whirlpool in a river. The water's always moving, but the whirlpool itself stays in one place. The ego is like that. It's just a habit, a stable pattern that your reality loop has fallen into over and over again. Here's another way to think about it. Imagine your perspective is a marble rolling around in a bowl. Now, the ego isn't the marble. The ego is the shape of the bowl. And over your entire life, all your experiences, your beliefs, your actions, they've been carving that bowl. The deep, well-worn groove at the very bottom, that's your ego. It's the default place the marble just naturally settles. And having that deep groove is actually super useful, right? I mean, can you imagine if it wasn't there? It would be exhausting. The ego makes the world manageable. It saves a ton of energy because we don't have to reinvent ourselves from scratch every single morning. It gives us this predictable sense of self so we can actually make plans and, function. But hold on a second. We all know we change. I mean, think about who you were 10 years ago. You're not that person anymore, right? So if the ego is this super stable groove, how do we explain that? How do we change? This is where it gets really cool. The concept is called ego drift. Think about it. Every single time your reality loop runs, there's a tiny, irreversible loss of information. It's like a tiny bit of computational dust, a little bit of entropy. It's unavoidable. Now, one cycle doesn't matter, but over millions and millions of cycles, over years of your life, all that tiny information loss adds up, and it slowly, gradually deforms the shape of the bowl. So look at this timeline. At 20, the bowl is wide and shallow. You're flexible, open. At 40, it's deeper, more defined. By 60, it's a very well-worn path. So you see, changing as a person isn't a failure to be consistent. It's not a bug, it's a feature of the system. It's the natural, unavoidable result of just living. Your identity isn't some static thing you have, it's a process you are. Okay, so now we can zoom back out. With all that in mind, the loop, the different tunings, the ego drift, we can finally go back to our very first question. Why can't we agree? Why do two people see the same event and come to completely different conclusions? This example makes it so clear. You've got observer A, their loop is sampling social cues, their emotional lens values harmony. Then you have observer B, they're sampling hard data, their lens values accuracy. They are in the exact same meeting, but because their internal reality engines are tuned differently, one walks out saying, wow, that meeting was tense, and the other says, that was a very productive meeting. Who's right? The model says they both are. Their conclusions are perfectly consistent with the data they sampled. They just ran different software. So what does this all mean? Is reality just whatever we want it to be? Are we all just stuck in our own subjective bubbles with no objective truth? Well, not exactly. The answer this model gives is, I think, even more interesting and profound than that. The idea here is what's called a superpositional informational reality. That's a mouthful, I know. But basically, it suggests that the world out there, before we look at it, is in this high-dimensional, uncollapsed state. It's holding all the potential information, all the possibilities, at once. It's only when we observe it that it collapses into our experience. So reality is this vast, infinitely complex thing, and our perspectives, they're just flashlights. We're each in a massive, dark room, and all we have is this little beam of light. So we're not making up what we see out of thin air. No, we are illuminating a real, valid part of the room. But it's just one tiny, incomplete slice of a much, much bigger shared space. And this brings us to the big resolution. There is one shared reality out there, but there are tons of legitimate ways to sample it. And here's the kicker. There is no privileged perspective. No one person's flashlight beam is the complete or correct one. So disagreement isn't a bug in the system, it's not a failure of logic. It's just what happens when finite, unique minds try to wrap their heads around an infinitely complex world. Which leaves us with a really big question, doesn't it? If every perspective is a valid but totally incomplete slice of the truth, how in the world do we build a shared world together? How do we learn to value what's in other people's flashlight beams so we can all see a little bit more of the room? That's the challenge, and maybe the real opportunity this model points to. Thanks for digging into this with us.